Hello. Today is January 1st, 2026. In our time, today is New Year's Day. Happy New Year. In the Crown of Aragon, 639 years ago, it was also January 1st, but it had been the new year for a few days already. So it was January 1st, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. I'm super excited about today's document for a bunch of different reasons. So, one reason is that I know what it means. It's in Catalan, I'm in my comfort zone. I pretty much am able to read every word of today's document. It's a letter from Joan to his brother, Martí. This letter I became aware of through an article by Claire Ponce, and then she directed me to a resource that I already had used before, but it's a gigantic compendium of transcribed letters out of the archive of the Crown of Aragon. And like Daniel Girona y Llagostera, there was another figure of the Catalan Renaixença that contributed a gigantic amount of work to bringing in the letters of the Archive of the Crown of Aragon to a broader audience because he transcribed a whole bunch of them. This person's name is Antonio Rubio y Luch, and his collection of transcribed documents that he published in 1908 focused on culture. Antonio Rubio y Luch was really interested in the beginning of what became known as Catalan humanism. And Catalan humanism is a concept that relates, of course, to the broader concept of humanism in general. And let me just explain that pretty quickly. I can't go too deeply into it. But humanism is the shift in cultural outlook from a religious-centered approach to an approach that's centered on the human experience, that puts the consciousness of the human being at the center and seeks to investigate the human condition as its own thing, apart from the theological questions of what God has created. This is actually a really gigantic shift, and most scholars put the beginning of humanism in Italy as part of what is commonly known as the Renaissance. And the idea of Catalan humanism complicates that by noticing how figures that were alive during Joan's reign, and in fact one of them knew Joan really well. His name is Bernat Metge. Bernat Metge is seen as the primary exemplar of a humanist approach to literature and philosophy in the Crown of Aragon in the late 14th century. So part of the Catalan Renaissance in the 19th century and leading into the beginning of the 20th century was a bunch of scholars making this argument that what was going on culturally in the Crown of Aragon in the late 14th century was humanism, as much as what was happening in the Renaissance in Italy was humanism. And guess what? Joan and Violant, they spent a ton of money promoting troubadours and poets and philosophers, and there was a real, and musicians, well, troubadours, musicians too, but there was a real efflorescence of culture during their reign. And this is one of the things that really got me interested in Joan and Violant even more, after I had really gotten into them based on the portrayal that I read about in Michael A. Ryan's book, A Kingdom of Stargazers, all about the astrology that was being practiced, not just by Joan, but also by Pere and Martí. Okay, that's some big background there, but Antonio Rubio y Lluch was one of the people that really got this going, this idea of Catalan humanism, and also he documented all of this material from the archive of the Crown of Aragon, like today's document. He doesn't offer a full transcription of the document. He summarizes it and pulls out notable parts. And I just want to say that looking at the document itself is a real bonus, because you get to see certain things, like it kind of like softens your response to what's going on in this letter, because Joan is writing to Martí, who is in Barcelona. Martí is there at their father's bedside. Sibylla has fled. Martí will eventually leave and pursue Sibylla. But at this moment that Joan is writing to him, he thinks that Martí is still there in the castle with their dying father. I think Martí really is still there and does receive this letter, but it's not exactly clear what happens to the requests that Joan makes. The requests that Joan makes in this letter, it's one of the reasons why I was so excited to talk about it, because it's quite funny. Joan makes a list of precious objects that are in their father's possession and says to Martí, "Can you please secure these items for me?" So when I first saw this mentioned in the collection by Antonio Rubio y Lluch, I was like, oh my gosh, they are total vultures. And it seemed a little bit heartless, but there was a lot of strife between the father and son, and so I guess it kind of fit in with that. But then I went into the letter, and it is the case, to be fair, that Joan begins the letter with a lot of kind words about his father's illness. It's displeasing to him that his father's illness seems very grave. He hopes that his father recovers. That's how the whole thing begins. And maybe that's just niceties and he doesn't really mean it, but it's important to realize that he really does say those things, and he prefaces his request for a bunch of objects by saying, "I really do hope that our father doesn't die." Let's talk about the objects themselves. So there's quite a list here, and the list itself is super interesting. So the first things that appear in the list of objects that Joan wants Martí to secure as their father is dying are two books. They're both books that are copies of Roman histories. So one is by Livy, and the other is by Valerius Maximus. And so these are books that have anecdotes about what happened in the history of the Roman Empire. So Joan is really interested in those. And he also lists a bezoar stone. Bezoar stones were thought to have magical properties. The bezoar stone is actually something that gets barfed up from an animal. Yes, so the animal is digesting a bunch of stuff. It's like maybe like the equivalent of a kidney stone or something, but you barf it up. And so they were thought to have these magical properties, I guess because of the way they look. I'm not quite sure the background on the bezoar stone. But anyway, apparently King Pere has a bezoar stone, and Joan says to Martí, go get that and make sure no one else takes it. Something else that he wants are the astrolabes and the quadrants, some of the navigation instruments he's interested in, which I think is kind of cool. And on the web page for this episode, I found 2 pictures of museum objects that are similar to probably what Joan was thinking of, because they're an astrolabe and a quadrant of Iberian origin around this time. So you can take a look at that. The last 2 items are pretty funny. So I was saying objects, but also Joan is interested in animals. Joan was really into hunting, and that's a complicated thing because hunting is not the same as we think of hunting in our modern time. So the 2 other items in Joan's list are related to hunting. One is a dog named Cordero, and he doesn't say anything else. Like, does he have a connection to this dog? Or maybe, I mean, certain hunting dogs were super famous. Like, elites would like write to each other being like, I've got this great hunting dog, so awesome, his name is da-da-da. And other people would be like, oh, well, see if you can mate that dog, and I want the offspring, and I'll trade you my, so basically there was a whole thing about hunting dogs, and they were famous among elites. They wrote to each other about their cool hunting dogs, and so maybe that's how Joan heard about this dog. Or maybe Joan actually knew this dog from before he and Pere stopped talking to each other. So it's really, I don't know, I think an intriguing set of questions about Joan's desire for this one particular dog. And then the other, it's a group of animals, a bunch of falcons. So falconry was a really big deal in this time among the elite class. Falconry was a much enjoyed sport, and there were falconers on staff, and it was like a whole production. But the falcons that Joan identifies in this letter are those belonging to Bernat de Fortia. That is Sibylla's brother. So basically, Joan is saying, go get Sibylla's brother's falcons and make sure that I have them when I arrive to Barcelona. So that's the content of the letter. And this document is doing so much. This document is transmitting information about what was most valuable to Joan. It's not like a bunch of jewels. It's not like a stash of money. It's these cultural items that are at the top of his concern. This document is communicating things about the family dynamic. This document is really cementing this level of trust between Joan and Martí. Like, Joan knows that he can ask Martí to grab a bunch of items, and Martí will not judge him for it and say, oh, you're a bad son, you should really just be consumed with grief over your father's death. No, they are on the same page when it comes to the emotional dynamic here, as their father is dying after all of the strife and estrangement. And Joan trusts Martí to carry this out. That says so much. It's a very emotionally full letter. And another aspect of that, if you kind of get into some close reading of it, is that Joan is calling his brother Moltcar Frere. Moltcar Frere, most dear brother. Well, that's an echo of the title of this season of the podcast, in which I've lifted out a phrase that Joan uses for Violant, molt cara compagnona. So it actually made me stop a little bit when I looked at this letter in its archival format, and made me think, oh, maybe molt cara compagnona was not exactly like the best name for the season, because maybe it doesn't have this added emotional power that I thought it did. But then again, maybe it does. Maybe the fact that he's using a similar formula for his brother is speaking to something that actually makes that emotional impact of molt cara compagnona all the more justifiable in my interpretation. So I feel pretty good still. But when I saw that, and I saw it repeated, Moltcar Frere, a bunch of times in this letter, I was like, oh my gosh, that's also what he does with Violant. But maybe it's a sign of the intense affection, and maybe it's formulaic. I'm going to have to look at more documents in order to corroborate that. So this document is super fun. It's a real joy to talk about. It just gets into all these different topics that connect to what interests me so much about Joan and Violant. All right, that brings us to the close of this episode. I didn't go through all these questions that I have about this document. I'll just kind of leave those up on the webpage for you to take a look. And if you haven't made it over to the website yet, see if you can get over there, jonathanseyfried.net, because I really am trying to put a lot of interesting stuff up on the webpage for each episode, stuff that really just won't fit in the show notes format in the podcast apps. So give it a try. And also, I'm tracking the way that I'm using AI. I do want to just really quickly say that AI is not ethically unproblematic. There are ethical problems with using AI, but in certain instances, it's been a super helpful thing. And for me in this research, but I'm using it very carefully and cautiously. All right, better wrap up the episode there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I have done my job. The motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed, in the sense that you never have all your questions answered, but hopefully you're enjoying it a little bit. All right, visit the website, like I said before, to see an image of today's document and to see some of the bibliographical references that I mentioned in today's episode. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.